I'm joined today by Clemson University assistant coach Anthony Goins. And coach, my first question for you is, have you ever had any personal experience with either unconstitutional nonviolent police harassment or with unconstitutional non-lethal police brutality?
Yeah. There's been times that I've been pulled over, and may not have been doing anything or whatever it may be. You know, Probably at the majority of stops that I've been in. I grew up, spent my high school years in Chesapeake, Virginia. So as I started to drive, I've had situations there. Um, Situations in college in New York. Um, I've lived, kind of all over the map a little bit in Connecticut. So definitely had some situations in those. But I think the thing that's kind of a little weird is that, like, when it happens, as a black person, you're not shocked anymore. You're not like, oh man, like I can't believe you did that. You just like, you almost kind of expect it at this point, or you're waiting for it to happen. And you just want to make sure that you're as best you can, try to be prepared when it does happen, and just try to make it out of the situation.
So it sounds like wherever you've lived, not daily, but rather persistently, you've been doing the speed limit, your tag's up to date, and all of a sudden you're being pulled over and you're not sure why.
Yeah.
And they're asking questions like, what are you doing in this neighborhood? Or what are you doing out so late? And that type of thing. And you spoke to the normalization of it. And, coach, I've had hundreds of these types of conversations over the years before I started doing these interviews. And a bunch of times I've said, hey, have the cops ever given you a hard time for no reason? And the person will say, no, you know what, man, I've been pretty lucky. And I've said, you mean you've never been pulled over when you weren't committing a moving violation? And they're like, well, yeah, that happens. Yeah, that happens, all the time. And it's like the normalization of it is to the point where it's like, let's just let this go. Thank God we made it home alive, unlike a lot of others.
Right.
Just let it roll off of our back. And, what I want the white people watching to understand is that black people are not only human beings, but they're American citizens in this country. And we have First Amendment rights, such as freedom of expression, which means that you can dress any way you want or wear your hair any way you want. And that is constitutionally protected. It is not probable cause for police to give you a hard time. Same thing with freedom of association. It's completely okay for four young men to walk down the sidewalk together without that being an event that causes the police to have suspicion, to where they pull the car up and ask for everybody's IDs and all that kind of thing. And I want the white people to understand that, like, just because it's been so normalized in the lives of American black people that a clear majority from my conversations would just sort of are willing to sort of let it slide. Let's keep in mind that just because it's been normalized doesn't mean it's okay. And if you look about, like, a lot of white people's reactions with something like wearing a mask, which is not covered in the Constitution at all, and yet we're going crazy about our rights. So Black Lives Matter, Black rights matter too. And I really need, same thing with the Fourth Amendment, unreasonable searches, and being pulled over without just cause is a Fourth Amendment constitutional violation. No matter how common it is, that, even though it seems normalized, that makes it worse, not better. And so I just want the white folks watching to understand that. And then, Coach, my follow-up question is, of your closest circle of black friends and family members, roughly, I know you haven't done a formal survey, but ballpark, roughly what percent of them have experienced, at a minimum, unconstitutional, nonviolent police harassment?
Oh man, to be honest with you, I'd probably say it's between 90 and 95%. I think, again, like you said, it's almost a normalization of it, where everybody kind of has their own story about it one way or another, whether they were driving, whether they were in a car, whether they were walking down the street. Um, you know, it's just something that's probably going to happen in your lifetime, while you're driving, or you know, you may not be driving, you may be at a function, who knows. So you kind of get together sometimes and you share different stories of what's happened, or you know, you may be see somebody somewhere and like, man, you won't believe why I'm running late today. You know, this or this or this happened. But yeah, man, you get all types of questions. I know one time I got pulled over, and one of the first questions he asked me was, how many times have you been arrested? And then the next question he asked me was, whose vehicle is this? You know, and of course I said none. And you know, hey man, this is my car. Here's my registration. Like, if that's something you asked for, you know, my registration, then hey, you would have seen my names on it and all of that kind of stuff. But you know, you just get kind of used to those things happening. And as you talk about the rights and things like that, of like, you know, a group of black men walking down the street, or four of them, or whatever it may be. You know, I mean, I think some of that kind of goes and plays back into the mindset. I mean, there was at one point, you know, like as a slave, or you could be executed, you could be killed for gathering in groups. Like that was the thing. Those were laws. Like you could kill them for gathering in groups. And obviously, you know, it's not to the extent of that, but you can see how that plays into the psyche of like laws that are in place right now, where you talk about, you know, loitering, you know, and things like that. Like, again, as it shifted from slavery and shifted into how do we get them into slavery of, okay, now you can become a slave if you're imprisoned. Okay, well, you create laws that allow them to arrest you and get you into the system. But you know, I would say any black person that I know has had some sort of experience with some, you know, avenue of the legal system in terms of police and things like that. You know, everybody's experiences may be a little bit different, but I think the common theme is always that, you know, it's just about like, hey man, was I able to make it out of the situation? Okay, well, let's move forward.
Yeah, you mentioned a lot of things that are worth revisiting. You know, the normalization in your first answer, but also the historical context of just how long this has been going on. And as white people, we like to say, "Oh, that was a long time ago. That doesn't happen anymore." And yet, for example, it wasn't until 1986 the Supreme Court finally ruled it illegal for a prosecutor to blanketly remove potential black jurors if there was a black defendant. Mm-hmm. That wasn't even unconstitutional, according to the Supreme Court, until 1986. And yet, in 2007, the Mississippi State Supreme Court ordered a review and discovered that 21 years after Batson versus Kentucky, that was the name of the case, those procedures were still rampant, still. And so the notion that this doesn't happen anymore is just absolute non-empathetic, grossly inaccurate, propagandist bullshit. And so I'm glad you mentioned, you talk about loitering. And listen, if you're on private property, okay, fine, right? But if you're hanging out with 3 people on public property, again, that's not loitering, that's constitutionally protected freedom of association. And same thing with guns. You know, there's a lot of black men in prison for the so-called crime of possessing a gun. Well, how can you possess a gun? How can you bear arms without possessing arms, right? Mm-hmm. Not for using a gun in a criminal enterprise, just simply for having one. And it goes back to, again, that since the founding of our nation, when black human beings were categorized as 3/5 of a citizen in the Constitution, we have never, ever, as a society, properly valued and respected black rights. And, you know, culturally, we fail to connect. It's like we see the murders, which is the tippy top of the iceberg, the police on black murders, when George Floyd gets murdered. We see that. But there's a culture, since before our nation was even technically founded, of of policing systems being grossly discriminatory and violent toward black people. And the reason why we're doing these interviews is the culture that allows the police to systematically abuse black people's rights to the point that it feels normalized to black people and is almost never even discussed by members of the media and even by a lot of activists. And the failure to connect the culture that permits the systematic abuse of black rights with the system that permits the brutality and the murders of black humans, these things are connected. They're clearly connected, and they should consequently be viewed collectively. And with that being said, because it's called the Not Isolated Project, you already answered the question. But if it's happened to you and to virtually every black friend and family member in your life, is it safe to say you do not consider this problem to be isolated, as so many white people continually insist?
No, definitely not. I think sometimes people get the perception of like there's two kinds of black people, but there's not. There's not. It's funny, one of the times while I was living in Connecticut, I had a situation, where I got pulled over and, I got some quote unquote unfair questions and things like that. And I shared it with a group of people. And I had a colleague email me and he said, wow, I was really disappointed to hear you had to go through that. I didn't think things like that happened to people like you. And I said, well, what do you mean people like you? He's like, well, you're educated and, you have a college degree and you carry yourself a certain way and things like that. And I said, there's no two kinds, there's not the, educated and uneducated or whatever it may be. Like, it just happens to you, it doesn't, know your background, it doesn't, whatever it may be. There's no two kinds. So it's never an isolated situation. It's never, again, I've lived in, I was born in North Carolina, went to middle school and high school in Virginia. I spent summers with my dad down in South Carolina. So, I got family in Georgia. So I've spent a ridiculous amount of time in the South, but also went to college in New York, lived in Connecticut, for over 6 years, lived in New Hampshire. So, been all over the Northeast as well. And it didn't matter where I was, like I have some sort of experience in all areas. So it's not isolated to a certain type of black person, it's not isolated to a certain region. It's just something that's going to happen. But, it kind of goes back to, like you talked about, okay, when the founding fathers put together a constitution, like that in and of itself is a little weird because we talk about, hey, people who founded this country, when, hey man, there were Native Americans here. Like there were people here. So like, how do you say you found something when there was somebody already standing there? Like that's always baffled me. But then you also talk about like, hey man, when they created the Constitution, everybody in that room owned slaves. So of course they wouldn't think about, black people's rights. Like that thought wouldn't even have come up to them if you already own slaves. Everybody in the room owns slaves. So no, you're not going to put something in there that's going to think about their rights. Their rights weren't thought about. So as long as you kind of have that history, and unless you're willing to say, man, these people weren't accounted for when we were putting together the laws and the Constitution and the commandments that were going to govern this nation. Okay, we need to rectify some of that, and how do we do that? And people of power need to say, okay, well, we need to rectify how basically this country was put together in terms of the thought process.
Yeah, the history, failure to connect the history is without a doubt part of the problem. And I'm glad you mentioned the issue of what you could term the "you're one of the good ones" phenomenon, right? Where a lot of white people are like, well, if they wouldn't have sagged their pants, or they, it's like to your point, no matter your circumstances, if you're black, you've dealt with this stuff. But also, The implication, the very insidious implication in what that person wrote to you was that if you were wearing overalls and sandals and had dreadlocks and didn't graduate from college, then it would be okay for the police to systematically abuse your rights. And this really goes back to the fundamental issue. We had to look at black people as subhuman in order to justify slavery morally. And we've never gotten past that.
Yeah. Well, I think
when the person that wrote you that said that, what they're saying is like that the others, the less educated black people, the poorer black people, they're not, you can't view someone as a citizen until you view them as a human first. And it's sad that we're still fighting that.
Well, I think, and the person who sent that to me, like, he's not a bad person or anything like that. And, it's one of those deals where I think there's been a situation where, in America's minds or in people's minds, the picture of, hey, someone who looks like this should be feared. Like, hey, if he has dreadlocks or if he has tattoos or if he's wearing this type of clothing, the media has perpetuated that, like, hey, you should be afraid of this person. A quote, that's what a quote, a large black man, like you should be afraid of them, like they're going to do X, Y, and Z to you. So again, like you said, in your mind, if you see someone that looks like that, if they're getting some sort of treatment by a police officer or by someone, by a white person or whatever it may be, like in your mind, okay, well, they must have done something because the media has taught you to think that you should be afraid of that person. That person is going to do something to you. But in reality, we all know that that's not the case. And again, that goes back to, the whole movie that was shown at the White House, The Birth of the Nation, where, that's when it really started to be put in people's minds that, like, hey, you should be afraid of the black man. Like they're going to, kill you and, and all of that kind of stuff. And, but, like you said, that was a way to, okay, we're afraid of them. So, hey, we can do X, Y, and Z to them. It makes them seem not human, basically below than an animal at times.
Yeah, it unfortunately, again, we've been dealing with this, and the stereotypes haven't changed. And if you think about it, so if you look at an enslaver, and a lot of white enslavers are on the record writing about their fear of meeting a violent end from one of the human beings that they enslaved. And just the irony and the hypocrisy of that, when the white enslaver is enacting daily, brutal regimes of violence every single day, and yet they have the audacity to point at the enslaved human beings with black skin and act as though they were the violent ones.
Yeah,
and
I think that's called like displacement or something like that, where you think I'm going to do it to you because you did it to me.
Yeah, I don't know if I've heard that phrase. I would more call it like hypocritical projection.
I think there's a psychological term for it. It might be displacement. I can't remember. My wife's a psychologist, so like I've heard her talk something about that. But like it's like, you think I'm gonna do it to you because you do it to me, type of deal. But yeah, it's unreal.
Yeah, I wrote about in my book that the astonishing hypocrisy of white people, because if you look at the so the four main negative stereotypes that we insist are true about black people, which is violent, sex crazed, lazy, and stupid. Those same four stereotypes have been around since the days of slavery. And so imagine a white enslaver who's a rapist complaining about how sex crazed the black people are. A white enslaver who sits on a porch drinking tea, watching enslaved human beings toil for free, talking about how they're the lazy ones. A white enslaver that implemented a brutal regime violence, acting as though the enslaved black human beings were the violent ones, and someone who could be so delusional and so stupid as to believe the first three things, making disparaging remarks about the enslaved human being's intelligence. And I tell people all the time, because so many white people go down the path of, well, if the blacks would just work harder. Say, hold on just a second. Just understand this. That trope, that racist trope, was said by the enslavers. So if your words looked in the mirror, they'd see the words of an enslaver. Are you sure you want to be enslaver adjacent when you're the one who told me a minute ago that you're not racist, you don't see race, and blah, blah, blah? And so it's really, it sucks and it's horrifying that we're still dealing with the same shit. And I hope that in my heart and mind, if we can convince the majority of white Americans of two things: one, no, it's not isolated, and two, no, it's not in the past, that maybe a voting majority of white people will get with the program. But I don't know. What else is on your mind, Coach?
You know what? Like, I think it's great that we're able to have these sort of conversations now, right? Like, I think, for so long, we were moving so fast with our lives that, you saw the social injustice, you saw the systematic oppression, you saw, police brutality, but it was almost like, okay, you saw it one day and then, okay, I have something else to do the next day. So like it's out of sight, out of mind, and you're moving so fast that you don't spend time to address issues. I think there's moments in our in time that you have to kind of make the most of in order to create some change. And I think, obviously us having to slow down even more due to the coronavirus, it's caused a lot of people to be able to spend time educating themselves on this, or spend time talking to people that could educate themselves or educate them on it. And in hopes that people who may not have known or may not have paid attention have that aha moment, like, wow, I can't believe I've been this blind to it, or wow, I can't believe, I didn't know X, Y, and Z. And, that education goes from, black people to white people, and black people may have had the experiences, but may not necessarily have known the history or background of why these things happen. Right. And so I think it's caused everybody to do more research, but it's great that we're being able to have these conversations with one another, and that people are open to having these conversations. My hope is that it moves forward with some sort of action, right? We talked before about laws that, like, whether it be loitering or even something like jaywalking, right? Like, you think about it again during the Jim Crow times, if you were walking on the side of the street of, a white person, you were supposed to cross the street, right? You're not supposed to be walking on the same sidewalk, right? So obviously you put yourself in a situation where you got to get to the other side of the street fast as possible. Okay. So you're just going to cut across. That's jaywalking. Now I can put you in jail for those things, So you talk about all these laws that were created at a time, post-slavery, pre, kind of civil rights, or during the civil rights times, that are still in place right now. The hope is that you can start getting some sort of change in some of these laws, because in my opinion, and obviously there's a whole of things that needs to change, but you get real change through legislation. You talk about, when Martin Luther King was able to get some sort of change, and towards the kind of the end for him, like, he was starting to get angry about it, right? And you can see it in the speeches and all of that kind of stuff, but he wanted change in terms of legislation. He stopped caring about changing people's hearts. He wanted to change legislation to make what was being done illegal. And then there was no, like, gray area in it. It's either legal or not legal, one of the two. And you know, he wasn't about like, hey, we need to change this person's heart and things like that. Like, no, just change the laws. And so my hope is that these conversations that more and more people are open to have, will lead to some sort of change in the legal system, in terms of some of the things that are in place right now.
Well, and I'll say this: I know that Dr. King's life was filled with virtually unlimited disappointments. I know that one of the great ones is that after the Voting Rights Act and Civil Rights Act were passed in '64 and '65, respectively, a lot of white people that he thought he could count on were like, wait, you're still going with this stuff? We just passed the two. Like, what is the, like, what more do you want? We already passed this, and we're going to see something legislatively come of this. That's going to happen. I don't know if it's going to be the GOP bill, the Democrat bill, but whichever bill it is, it's going to be some level of modest progress. And what I really, really, really hope this time around, the white people who think of ourselves as allies don't make the same fatal mistake we made in '65 of congratulating ourselves in a stationary way and imagining as though the race was finished. No, whatever national stuff gets passed, that's but the next step on the climb up Justice Mountain. And we're not particularly close to the top yet.
You can't completely call it equality if like, hey man, you know, it's tilted like this, and then, okay, you know, we did this a little bit. You know what I mean? Like, you can't, you know, that old symbol of the judicial system, of the kind of the balance a little bit. Like, you can't call it equal if one's up here and the other one's, and then all you do is you change two laws. Okay, now it's like this, just a little bit. Like, no, there's still a big fight to get it here. You know, like, you have to keep adding on so that, you know, you can equal it out.
No, the only federal legislation that could bona fide, that could in a real way provide some level of permanent fix in terms of economic equality is doing full reparations for everything. Not just for slavery, but for all of the land theft, with all the massacres, and all of the wage theft during Jim Crow, and all of the Montgomery GI Bill after World War II. The implementation of that was unbelievably, despicably racist. The Montgomery GI Bill basically created the white middle class in Long Island and New York and excluded black people from that entirely.
Yeah.
The education inequity. In Mississippi, black school children from 1900 to 1960 received something like 30% of the funding that white school children did. Well, we need to take that ratio and flip it for another 60 years. And I favor a separate appropriation, by the way. I'm not trying to take money away from majority white schools. I think there needs to be a separate appropriation for that. And there's a lot of those issues. You know, Bank of America had to pay a $335 million fine in 2011 for flagrantly discriminating against qualified black borrowers. You know, well, I would have rather seen that $335 million go directly to impoverished black people rather than a fine that goes to the government. Like that, I'm not even, I'm okay if reparations begin in any form, whether it's coming from the private sector or whether it's coming from corrupt landlords like Donald Sterling's estate, or whether it's coming from the government itself. But anything short of full reparations for everything we've done, because to your point, you did this, and that's exactly right. It's like we made black people poor on purpose. We kept black people poor on purpose. We did not even let black people own homes en masse until the 70s and the 80s. And it was still harder than it was for white people, which means the first generation of black property owners hasn't even passed on yet, which means the first generation of black inheritance hasn't happened yet. So we make black people poor on purpose. We keep black people poor on purpose. And then we look at y'all like, why are y'all still poor? Y'all just need to work harder. Well, what we need to do is rectify the injustice done in the past, and get black people on as level of a playing field as we can, and then go from there. But unfortunately, we're politically, I think, a decently long way away from that. But what I really hope the white people who are watching and the white people who are relatively new to this fight, I've said this before, you've got a yard that we'll call the righteousness yard, and you got a yard next door we'll call the racism yard. And then you got a fence. And the vast majority of white people are sitting on that fence. Mm-hmm. Like the gentleman who reached out to you and said, oh, I didn't think that happened to you because you're one of the good ones. He didn't say those words, but that's a phenomenon that, well, I don't think that person's in the racism yard. I don't think he wants to harm you, but he's not in the righteousness yard either. He's on the fence. And I'm one of these guys who's like, come on off the fence, y'all. There's lots of room. I'm not mad at you. Come on off the fence. And I'm not mad. I'm not mad that they're late. I am going to be mad when they try to hop back on the fence. And that's what I'm going to carefully monitor. We're going to see a massive federal legislative package come through. And my fear is a clear majority of the white people calling themselves allies are going to be like, we did it.
Yeah.
Right. And they're just going to want to move on with their lives. And I really hope that we don't do that this time around.
Yeah. Well, you saw that happen when Barack Obama was elected.
Exactly. And Obama never got 51% of the white vote.
Right.
Never. So it's not like and that train of thought wouldn't have made sense anyway. Just because you elect a black president doesn't mean that every white dominant institution that's been acting discriminatorily for centuries is going to suddenly be like, oh, we got a black president, y'all. It's time to be fair to black bars. It's time to be fair to black renters. It's time to be fair to just to black citizens, speaking broadly. I mean, the GOP still does everything they can to suppress the black vote. Still, to this day, in 2020. And they're going to be even more buck wild in this election than maybe any election before. So, I hope white folks can realize that it's not isolated and it's not in the past, and that this is a prolonged fight. We're not there is no package of federal laws that they're discussing that's going to come close to fixing this. Right? If they were talking about full reparations, lengthy prison sentences for landlords who discriminate, lengthy prison sentences for police chiefs who have departments that are out of control, lengthy prison sentences for bank executives when qualified black borrowers are denied, lengthy prison sentences for school principals that have disproportionate rates and suspensions between black kids and white kids, lengthy prison sentences for all the people using the institutional levels of power in a racist way to harm black people. Lengthy prison sentences. No more fines, lengthy prison sentences, and full, complete reparations. If that federal package were to happen, even I might be like, we did it. But those things aren't even being discussed. So I hope people understand that whatever comes from this is not enough. And there's lots of work left to do. And so do not try to hop your ass back on that fence. Yeah. Stay with us and keep fighting until this thing is done.
Yeah, I would just encourage people to, as you see things come up federally, locally, just think about, okay, like, is there something in this law? Is there something in this bill? Is there something in this policy that maybe negatively affects black people? And if it does, like, because again, you see something like, oh, that sounds like a great idea, but you don't necessarily think like, well, how does this affect someone else? Sit back and think about those things for a second. If it does, all right, like, maybe that's something like, hey man, maybe we should vote against this. You know what I mean? And I think a lot of people don't necessarily know that, like, hey man, the president isn't the one making laws and things like that. It's a lot of times it's local and state officials that are involved in those things. So, really educating them, educating yourself on how people that are running for these offices really think and believe, and if this is somebody you should genuinely be voting for. And then if there's an opportunity to put forth an effort to change something, change a law, or if you're in a position, whether you be whether you're a hiring manager or whatever it may be, if you're in a position in a business, a company, whatever it may be, to kind of bring some sort of equality, like then you're contributing to the fight. Like you're doing something to contribute to the fight if you're in a position to make some sort of change.
Yeah, the Rooney Rule was a good thing for the NFL. I wish that college sports had it as well, and I also wish that there's so many things we need to fix. Like, for example, as long as the search firm world's a white-dominated space, it's going to be hard. As long as the vast majority of white presidents are white and athletics directors are white, it's going to be hard. And how about this for a stat? If a jury has one black person and a black defendant, the conviction rate's 99%. If the jury has 3 or more black people, the conviction rate's 92%. And what that speaks to, I think, is that if there's one black voice on a committee and they speak up and all the white people say, oh, you're just pushing the black candidates. Well, it's an awfully lonely island to be on. And you can even get gaslit and start to wonder, man, am I just pushing the black candidates? Versus if there's real representation inside of power structures that make hiring decisions. If there's 10 people in a room and 3 or 4 are black, and all 3 or 4 black people say, whoa, this list is, this dude's got tweets in the past that, he likes a Donald Trump tweet calling Kaepernick a son of a bitch. And 95% of our student athletes in men's basketball are black, and he's on the list. What the hell's going on here? And if there's 3 or 4 black voices in the room, then the other white folks are much more likely to be like, oh yeah, that didn't, like, yeah, you're right. Like calling a peaceful protester a son of a bitch when he's protesting against multi-century-old racism-based brutality. Yeah, maybe that's not, maybe that's not cool. And so I hope that there's representation inside of the power structures that make the hiring decisions. Like, I would love for, like, and I know it's hard to do, but like if the NCAA passed a rule that said you're not allowed to hire a search firm unless 25% of that searcher's employees are black, I think that would make a massive difference. But we could probably talk policy all day. I wrote like 100 and something pages on the topic. But I know you got a lot going on, and I got another one of these coming up with an attorney friend of mine here in about 15 minutes. So I'm gonna let you roll unless you got something else. And any other final words or departing thoughts?
No, again, thanks for inviting me up here, and just being able to have these conversations, and as I continue to educate myself on these things, and as people are willing to sit down and have these conversations, I think it's great to be open to have those conversations. And again, in hopes that someone may have that aha moment where they're like, you know what, like I'm going to go and do something about it.
Anthony Goins, my friend, Clemson University. Congratulations, by the way, on the new gig. I know you're not brand new there, but I really appreciate your time and your insights, and look forward to following your career moving forward and staying in touch.
I appreciate it, man.